Alissa, I'm really excited to dive into the book. I think, as you and I previously discussed, it's very relevant to the work we do at Vermont Works for Women, but I also just think, being a woman and a human being in this society, that this book is incredibly relevant for what we're dealing with, especially post-pandemic. So I would love to start with where this idea came from. How did you come up with the concept or want to write Bootstrapped?
Well, yeah, so, I run this organization, as we were just discussing, and a lot of our contributors are working poor, and some of them are, as you just mentioned, downwardly mobile, and they're trying to get by, and they're writing reported essays about their experience for us. And meanwhile, the commenters, and there's always, don't read the comments, but you have to when you're editing something, and the commenters are like, why is this person a single parent? Why is this person, why didn't they go to college? Why did they go to college? Why did they get job training? Why didn't they get job training? And so it's a constant, kind of rondelay of blame in the comments. And then I get emails to the same effect. And then I got some of the same remarks about, pieces I wrote, like, why is this person drinking alcohol? This is somebody who's on SNAP, whose kid's disabled. It's like, yeah, I definitely drink alcohol with less of a burden, And it was this moral outrage around people who are struggling in any way, vulnerable in many different ways, but especially economically vulnerable. And so I really wanted to look into the myths, and I thought I was just going to write the story about these folks and their firsthand experience, and I did. But then the pandemic happened, and I was trapped, and I started to read Horatio Alger and Laura Ingalls Wilder and Emerson. I read Emerson again at Thoreau, or Thoreau as I've started to call him, and also other sort of fan favorites of individualism, or as I call big male independent energy, TM, and sort of why did they write in this register? What was going on in their own lives that they thought that they were so independent and individualistic? What is that accurate? And I found all kinds of very surprising things. And Ayn Rand is another example too.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I have to say too, I love that Thoreau, because if you read the book, it's a great description of that relationship and what I didn't realize, and a myth that I had been told growing up. Same with Little House on the Prairie. What was your favorite kind of myth to research or essentially dispel throughout the book?
Well, I don't know. The Horatio Alger myth is pretty shocking, so maybe I should start with that. So, everyone heard of the Horatio Alger story? Do you know what the Horatio Alger story is? So people often, politicians like Trump, will say about his father, my father was a Horatio Alger story. And what he means by this is this 19th century, early 20th century, I think he dies beginning of the 20th century, novelist who wrote 127 or so books, sold millions and millions of copies, and they're all novels about young men, teenagers really, really poor, buskers, peddlers. And then suddenly they make it. So they work and work and work, and they make it. They become the head of a business. They have a nice home, etc. So they're called rags to riches stories. And so Horatio Alger's story becomes another way that people say rags to riches. Now I went back and read these. These stories, first of all, are not the story of that when you do a close reading of them, and also Horatio Alger's biography is shocking. He was a pedophile. And he had actually adopted 2 boys from the Bowery that he used as the model for these young men in the Horatio Alger story. So he was actually this kind of predatory person. And I think part of the rags to riches spin that people gave the story was to try to cover up. I mean, the people who believe in the Horatio Alger story today are often the same kind of types that would talk about grooming. Right? And the actual story was a story of grooming, and when you do close readings of the novels, it's almost always a rich old man who meets this gorgeous teenager and makes him into a renowned adult, success story. So yeah.
But that's not how the story is often told. Is you don't hear about the wealthy, generally white individual that came and helped that individual actually get to that level of success, to be a known name.
Yeah, what's really interesting is that a lot of 19th century British fiction has the benefactor.
Yeah.
And so it's more, in some ways, I've never really compared it, but when I think about it, it's more overt. It's like Jane Eyre, or, like there'll be somebody who comes in, or a lot Dickens, and it's less this kind of rags to riches story, which partially because that's so deeply American, audiences received it also as something other than what it was. And it was made into something by politicians who referred to Horatio Alger's story. And also, like, celebrities called themselves Horatio Alger stories. Ronald Reagan termed himself a Horatio Alger story. It sort of became a thing.
Yeah. Well, and I think relevant to Vermont and our smaller, more rural communities, we hear it a lot. I built this farm from my bootstraps. I created this independently. And what would you kind of think as we look to the future? How would we dispel that to actually move our economy forward or to grow our communities in a positive way? Because from what we've learned in Bootstrapped, it is all interdependent at the end of the day. Those lines are there.
Yeah, including, I have like a workers' cooperative that's in Hanover. And there are other worker cooperatives in Vermont. And I think we need things like that. That's part of the mutualism. So the last third of the book is, towards a new American dream. Mm-hmm. And part of that are kind of very hands-on things, like workers' co-ops, like mutual aids, like participatory budgeting, where, does anyone know what that is? Mm-hmm. So in hundreds of cities, there's groups of citizens who get to, you could probably do this at, I don't know if Burlington has one, but they join their local city government and they look at the budgets and they vote on the budgets, and they now are sometimes given millions of dollars to have some control over. Mm-hmm. And they're usually just really ordinary people, right? Sometimes they're not even, they've never had any interface with political life. So I thought that was another wonderful community effort, along with the mutual aids. There's also peer-to-peer therapy, counseling, where people are co-counseling. So I talked to somebody who was in a group like that. We know how expensive therapy is. We know how desperately, especially kids, are so anxious. And so I thought that was a wonderful intervention. I call it inequality therapy, because there's also these therapists that are really trying to charge less. So that was yet another way in which I saw people working to dispel these stories on a small scale. But there's also bigger ways, and that we'll start with how we think about ourselves, and also how we think about our political life. So those are, broader ways to do it. And the final way is to try to break this self-made myth down wherever we see it in political life, to expose people like Donald Trump or Elon Musk, who keep claiming to be self-made. Which is kind of astonishing. Elon Musk, if you look at subsidy tracker, he just got billions for SpaceX and for Tesla from the government. Forget having been, whether or not his father had emerald mines in South Africa. But, and obviously Donald Trump had kept saying he's a self-made man, and people believe it. And so I think part of our project is to try to dispel it, the value of being self-made for one, and then the actuality of it when people use it as a storyline.
Well, and that draws into part of your nonprofit is really using journalism to raise some of not only these social challenges, barriers, historic contexts that we've lived in, but also what could solutions be. And for somebody in the nonprofit sphere, one of my favorite part of your books is giving unrestricted dollars, trusting in the process of those who are working directly with individuals and giving that funding to allow that to take place without the critique or the, what would you describe that as?
I described it as like a spouse. So I run a nonprofit, and the philanthropies can sometimes be almost like spouses, like, like, what did you spend that on? And so there's a thing in nonprofits that you want. It's called general operating, and that's, you want philanthropies to give you money without hesitation or kind of narrow casting, like, oh, you have to spend it on, and you probably experience this, you have to spend this all on, farmer re-education in this part of the state.
Yes, but don't buy a paperclip.
Right.
Don't do
that. And
don't.
And when people really desperately just need money, like what we did actually at EHRP, we made an executive decision, me and my colleague, when the pandemic happened, to just give people money. So before that, we were just an organization that people had to, they still do, have to write, photograph, film, illustrate, really remarkable stuff. We co-published 500 pieces. Placements. So hundreds of pieces a year, including in the Times, because we co-publish all kinds of major stuff, probably things you've read and seen. But we wanted to just give people money because people couldn't pay their rent, they had COVID, and we just started a thing where I raised $100,000 and we gave people, you know, not a lot, $2,000 maybe, so they could pay their rent and they could continue to participate. And that was a decision of kind of unrestricted giving. So we had to change course. But a lot of philanthropy does not like that. They don't, there's a phrase I really like, disaster giving, which is just that kind of giving, as if we're in a disaster. And I think given the state of housing injustice and food poverty and all kinds of other, we are in a state of disaster. Like, we should just have this kind of unrestricted giving as much as possible.
Yes, and we also, a lot of your book goes into the theme too, not just in the nonprofit realm, but also in government giving or government programming, and how that's seen as a negative. But if we look back historically, how often those that we look up to that have really made themselves as a success benefited from a government program that gave the Homestead Act, let's just say, or whatever it might be.
So I keep saying we have to go back into the past to get to the future. And part of the moments in the past were the Homestead Act of 1862, the biggest land giveaway, Laura Ingalls Wilder, beneficiary, her parents are GI Bill, and all sorts of other earlier ideas. I mean, even the American Dream, when it was coined in 1931, was our American dream. It wasn't my American dream. So that, I think there's moments in the past, the New Deal, you know, farmers, FSA, that were based on EHRP. That was the vision of the founder of EHRP with me, Barbara Ehrenreich. She saw that as a model for what we're doing in our organization, which is putting people often marginalized to work as journalists and photographers. And so that happened in the 30s. 6,000, 7,000 writers, including Zora Neale Hurston, Richard Wright, you know, Walker Evans, some of the great reporters and photographers of our time. And if they hadn't, I don't know what would have happened sometimes to their careers or their ability to continue. So we can look to the past as a model. There are many Black mutual aids in the 19th and early 20th century, many, and like through to the Black Panthers, there were mutual aids and workers' co-ops. Nobody talks about this history. I hadn't really read about it. And Du Bois has a whole book, 2 books on it. Who knew? So I think we just have to, like, we have to look to the past in the way that the people who would quote the rugged individualist cowboy narratives look to the past and take a whole other story from it.
Yes. Well, and even if we were to say to not look that far, but during the pandemic, we could call that disaster giving.
Yeah.
That a lot of aid and support was giving out. Do you feel that we're moving in a direction as a society that recognize that as a benefit, or do you think that people see that period of the pandemic as we're done, we can't go back and do that again? We did it one time.
I think I don't know how you guys feel, but I feel like everyone wanted to forget the pandemic. And there's kind of an amnesia now. And I find that a little distressing, especially if anyone has kids. Like, your kids haven't forgotten. They're anxious, they're depressed. It's like, right? Like it. So I think people who are honest with themselves, i.e. children and teenagers, they're still there.
Yeah.
So we have to process this still. And part of processing it is continuing some of these programs. I mean, the eviction moratorium helped many of the people that I have writing for me. I've had people writing for me who are evicted, and they report their own eviction. And I think that those stories are really important to hear because we think of that happening out there, but I just published a piece by an editor at Harper's who's being evicted, that had to pay to keep him from being evicted, you know.
Well, and Vermont is not exempt from these housing,
Yeah.
social inequities, income inequities, and it's, you know, plagued the state, but also it's a chance to reevaluate and say, how do we come together as rural communities or bigger and smaller communities and work together? So from what you researched through Bootstrapped, is there anything in the pipeline coming up that really excited you to dive in more, or something that you would like to kind of bring more awareness to?
Keep writing?
Yeah.
Well, the inequality therapy thing, I just am fascinated by that there are people trying to do this. I want to do more stuff on co-counseling, which is this thing where people who are traumatized counsel other people who are traumatized. I mean, it's almost like AA, but for mental health. And unfortunately, the woman who's the center, she just passed away, Sissy White. She was remarkable, so I want to talk about that just because So she was working for a program called ACEs High. ACEs Too High, I think of ACEs So High. ACEs are adverse childhood experience, and it's a matrix to extreme things that happen to kids, abuse and so forth. And she had like 8 ACEs, and then she wound up having ovarian cancer and dying. And but she was doing remarkable stuff. She was counseling other people. I sat in on some of the counseling sessions, and virtually. But that to me, that was really fascinating. This new kind of therapy, or people aware that we can't just ask everybody to, oh, go get a therapist. How's that? Okay, anybody who's tried to get a therapist for a kid or a teenager, has anyone here done? I mean, they're not a lot, then they're not affordable, and there's not access, and we're in a mental health epidemic right now, I think. And so inequality therapy, like just that framework, which was my framework, but I was like, I think I need to pursue this, and I'd like to find more examples even than I found in the book.
Well, and think about how cross-industry that could be. I think about our teachers and our education system and what a benefit that could be just to that one kind of sphere industry. So this could apply to both your foundation work and this book, and you might have answered it a little bit with but are you energized or exhausted as you look ahead?
I don't know.
Or a little bit of both.
A little bit
in
of
the
both.
same.
I mean, she's doing really great work with Vermont Works for Women. Like, I feel like I've been meeting people like you, Rhoni, and like other folks that are doing really incredible stuff just even on this tour. And that's been very exciting. Like, I don't know, just running nonprofits I didn't even know existed. Mm-hmm. Just talked to a lawyer for an economic justice organization. I'm like, oh wow, lawyers do this? New kinds of carceral justice organizations that are coming up, and but also like I feel like there's a great moment politically because we have people running for office now who don't claim to be Horatio Alger stories, like Maxwell Alejandro Frost in Florida. He's a representative, grew up working class, 26 years old, person of color, just got elected, came out as not being able to afford his rent in DC, and saying that he was surfing on people's couches. I found that incredibly inspiring. A lot of Republicans started, and then he's like, I don't fall for that bootstrap stuff. He started tweeting that. He's like, I can't afford it yet. You know, you make $174,000 as a representative, but he hadn't gotten that yet. So I think just having people who own automobile shops, like Perez is a new representative in Washington State. I don't know, I personally identify with them more. 51% of people, our representatives, are millionaires. I think that's kind of alienating to have so many people who are just so unrelatable.
Yep. Well, and it's if we were to bring it back locally, Vermont's not exempt from that. I think there's a movement here happening, especially with the younger generation that we're seeing. I mean, more than 50% of our state legislature has turned over, and I think that's a big step for Vermont in seeing what are the voices emerging, what's coming up, what are the stories we're hearing. And so we're seeing a lot of those, people are not pulling themselves up. They're explaining who helped get them there and why they're standing there, which leads me to my next question. And a great theme of the book is the interdependence of we all arrive at our success with help. And so who helped bring you to the success you are at today?
In the book I talk about Frank McCourt. Has anybody read Angela's Ashes? So he was my high school teacher, and so I was 13 years old, and he wrote, "You're a born writer" on my paper, and it totally changed my life. And I mean, he was a funny teacher because basically every story in Angela's Ashes he told in the classroom for an entire year. It was like every class was like, and that was when mom, whenever mom made, stew out of bread, like bread and logs or whatever. You'd be like, what? And it was like, and I was like, okay, are we gonna learn anything? But I think I learned so much just from his song, in a sense, because he basically was singing the whole, in a sense, metaphorically singing the whole class. And then, my grandparents, I've talked about my grandparents, they ran a shoe store, so Bootstrap is no accident. They had this psychoanalytic, deep structural reason for loving shoes, and I'd play with the shoes on the floor. But they just gave me unconditional love, and they're immigrants, not that well educated. My mom, she's a feminist intellectual. And then all the people who worked on this book with me, which are like a lot of different people. I mean, like, to make a book, you have to have your friends read it. you don't get a ton, I mean, I don't know if anyone here is an aspiring writer, but you don't get a ton of feedback while you're doing this. And even when you've finished it, you may have 2 rounds of edits maybe from your professional editor, but a book takes dozens of edits. So I mean, I had many friends look at this, and I had a designer look at the cover. I had basically helped design the cover myself. I mean, it's very DIY, even at a very professional press, and so I owe the book even, and that's one thing I've been loving, like people praising their sitter when they're thinking for a prize or something, journalists, actors, whatever. Or I just went to an art exhibit, the fabricators mentioned by name, and there's like 20 First of all, you're like, wow, this artist really did make this. Anyway, it was like, there are 20 fabricators who made it, often in China, right? Or like just the translators. I mean, this is another literature, like Jennifer, the big translator, Jennifer Croft, has now, changed translation by getting the name of the translator. These are like the kitchen, they were like the kitchen help of translation. So I think we're seeing either in terms of publishing an understanding of actual attribution. And I keep saying that we have to talk about attribution, not gratitude, and that attribution actually is the real gratitude. And that's like this kind of, related praise of what goes into making you or your world or your achievements. So yeah.
Well, and I appreciate it. It's a reframing, which I think is one of my favorite things about the book is let's reframe how we talk about our success or how we approach it, and then you hope that it filters into other places so that other people value what brings us all there. So one of my favorite descriptions, and this is more of what would you give all of us in the room as a piece of advice, but how Bootstrap is described as how can we shed the American obsession with self-reliance that has made us less healthy, less secure, and less fulfilled. What would be a piece of advice or an action to start doing that?
We'll vote differently. But also this kind of attribution. And I mean, for me, it was just like an internal understanding. Because I think a lot of people, like liberals, also fall into the bootstrapping myth of self-actualization. So especially women, like, I have to be my best self. I have to do everything really well. Like, you don't think, I have to make a lot of money maybe, or I have to be some huge success in a kind of ritzy way, but it's more just like I start running, it has to be 6 miles, I write about that. Pandemic, start baking bread, it has to be really good. Like I start with the glutinous, day bread, what is it, is it Sam Sifton? No, somebody else. Mark.
I'm not a bread maker, so I
Mark
can't
Bidman has that day bread thing. And at first it was chewy. I was like, oh, I'm so terrible. So we do this kind of internal punishment also. And that's part of the project of the learning the interdependence, and because it's not, I call it radical self-help, because to help yourself, it's not about the self. Like I think that to some level, dissolving the self is the self-help. It sounds Buddhist, but no.
Well, and it's very relative to, as an organization, Vermont Works for Women does not serve a certain demographic or type of individual or woman. We serve anybody that's really looking to find a job, a career, a pathway that's motivating, that's challenging, that's economically supportive. But we have these constant conversations about dispelling what you were taught. And I think for a very specific example, we work with justice-involved women. Constantly we're telling them nobody is self-made outside. Even those who don't come from an incarcerative setting still struggle. And it's okay to ask for help, and it's not wrong to ask for help, and it's not wrong to also share your story as part of your success as you get there. And success comes in a lot of different forms at a lot of different places in life. And I think that's what Bootstrapped helps people better understand in a lot of different historical contexts. I mean, all the way from the 1920s when they talked about this concept, all the way through to what we still watch on, Nick at Night TV with Little House on the Prairie. But it's really incredible to be able to take real lessons and apply them in a way that's actionable to what we need today, or feels relevant to what actually allows us to move forward on that next step.
Thank you so much.
And so,
yeah.
well, I appreciate that from our perspective. You know, selfishly, this was a great read for our organization. But I also think for anybody, even as an individual, I didn't know some of those myths. And I continue to think I need to do this on my own, or I don't want to recognize. And it's all a recognition of how we got here. I'm not even sitting in this chair without people around me that helped get us here. So I really appreciate you bringing that to light, shedding light more on it. There's so much more I know that can come from these stories and dispelling these myths, and that's especially applicable here in Vermont. And I'm excited that you came to Northshire Bookstore today to share with us and bring it to Vermont. Anything else before we go and break that you would like to share?
I think the main thing also that I got from this was I called the art of dependence, and I wrote about this in the Times, that dependence is an art, it's a craft, it's a skill, it's a grace. It's not something to be ashamed of, and we think we have to be independent, but actually being dependent can sometimes be take more and be more of an achievement. I don't know how to say, and to have people who are dependent on us. And so that's part of the reframe for me as well, you know. 1 in 4 people are disabled in this country. Like, if we're asking everybody to be independent, we're denying their experience. And we're denying what will ultimately be our experiences if we're lucky enough to age.
We're denying potential.
Yeah.
So what could be.
Yeah.